Hello everybody and welcome to Parks Bros. It's Drew here, and today is the day that Tidal Twister opens at SeaWorld San Diego, and it's also the day that we're going to do a full in-depth review. So the new for 2019 ride, Tidal Twister, has now officially opened at SeaWorld San Diego, located in San Diego, California, and is a first-of-its-kind Skyline Horizon model, and is the long-awaited sequel to rides like Harley Quinn Crazy Coaster at Six Flags Discovery Kingdom. Now, before we talk about the ride itself, we of course have to talk about the place it's at and how to get to the ride from the park's entrance. So SeaWorld San Diego is actually celebrating its 55th year of operation this year, and it was the first of the SeaWorld chain of parks. Now there are 3 that are owned and operated by the same companies, and this includes SeaWorld San Diego, SeaWorld San Antonio, and SeaWorld Orlando. And if you did not know, the Busch Gardens parks are also operated by the same companies. But once you make it to the front entrance of SeaWorld San Diego, which is this beautiful wave sculpture, you want to hug the gift shops on your left and take the left side of that fork and then keep going straight from there. You will end up passing in between the orca tanks as well as some of the dolphin tanks. And once you squeeze by those, you'll want to keep going straight and then hook a left at some restrooms. And then after those buildings are over, you're going to see the Shipwreck Rapids as well as the Shipwreck Cafe, and you will go and board the actual shipwreck itself and follow that all the way straight to the Bayside Amphitheater in the top left corner of the park, and you will see some tide pools as well as an aquarium to your left right before Tidal Twister will be right in front of you. So Tidal Twister is what SeaWorld is calling their 4th coaster and their 2nd coaster with an inversion, as well as their first dueling coaster that can reach up to speeds of a combined 60 miles per hour, and is Skyline's 2nd ever ride that is operating in a park. And here's some fun facts for you if you did not know. This is actually a collaboration between multiple different companies, because the track manufactured by RMC is a huge staple of the ride because it is that single rail styled track that RMC is known for. And we actually got to find out that Premier apparently did the ride system and mechanism, and here's the kicker: GCI did the station work. So it's really an all-around collaboration from 3 major American manufacturers, and of course Skyline is at the head of the design process and also was in charge of the trains, I believe. Now, I will first start this review by saying that this is not my favorite coaster or ride in the park. I would say Manta is still holding that very firmly, just because of its length and its re-rideability. But Tidal Twister surprisingly packed more of a punch than I was expecting. After everything I've heard about Harley Quinn Crazy Coaster up in Northern California, I expected this ride to be rough and that I was going to get major headbanging and was not going to be able to enjoy the ride at all. Now, I have not been on Harley Quinn Crazy Coaster at all, but I've heard a lot of people that I know talk about how they really don't enjoy the ride. So I was a little skeptical going into this, but I know Skyline made a lot of changes between Harley Quinn and Tidal Twister, including a new double bogey system, so using 2 wheels in conjunction instead of 1 per connection on the cars, and also the fact that it would be a different tire launch system than on Harley Quinn, and as well as many other improvements to the ride system itself. So that bumped my hope up a little bit, but I was still very skeptical going into this. Now, of course, once we saw it testing and realized that it was going to be quieter than Harley Quinn, and it also looked smoother, my thoughts on this ride actually being quite enjoyable definitely appeared, and I got quite excited to ride Tidal Twister around a month after it started testing. Now, fast forward to this past Tuesday, May 21st, we were so kindly invited to the media preview for Tidal Twister, and I can't thank SeaWorld enough for doing that. But that means we got to check out the ride before a majority of the public, as well as before season pass holders. So I'm sure there was a lot of kinks still going on with the operations, and to be honest, it didn't really hinder our ride experience whatsoever. But this, of course, is when they were running one side of the ride. And they also had a lot of camera equipment out, both on the ride and off the ride. But before we get onto the ride itself, I want to talk a little bit about the area surrounding it. So the ride wasn't the only thing that they ended up doing in this newly done area. They also painted the backdrop of the ride, which is the Bayside Amphitheater, where you will be seeing a Cirque show during summer, during the Electric Ocean event, which looks very awesome. And there is also some tide pools that you can interact with as a guest, and that is just adjacent to an aquarium, a freshwater aquarium mainly, where you can see some really gorgeous creatures up close and also find out a lot about the creatures themselves. Now, I think this area is really pretty. The landscaping is really well done, but I do want to add that both the tide pools and the aquarium were there before, but I think Tidal Twister really fits in that space quite well. I was a little concerned about tightness of walkways in that area, but it is definitely not a tight squeeze whatsoever. And I really thought the main problem was going to be in between the Bayside Amphitheater itself and Tidal Twister's entrance, but it looks like, from what we could see on the first pass holder preview day, is that that walkway definitely has enough room to let out a crowd from the amphitheater, as well as take in a crowd for Tidal Twister. But the exits are on the side of the touch pools, and I can see those getting a little cluttered sometimes, especially if a lot of people go over to the pools themselves. But overall, the space is quite open, and I think it's a beautiful area just to sit around and watch everything happen. You can get some great views of Shipwreck Rapids. You, of course, can probably hear the music from the Bayside Amphitheater, or you can go into a nice, quiet, dark room in the aquarium. This is all within about 100 yards, so it's very awesome to be able to experience all of that. Well, now that we've talked about the area, we've talked about kind of how to get there, let's talk about how to actually get on the ride and what the queues are like. So to get on the ride, you will actually go very close to the Bayside Amphitheater and go up against that wall and then take a left. And there you will see one singular entrance to the right side of a test seat. And the test seat was actually quite comfy, I will just say that right now. And it does have a red light when you can't ride and a green light when you can. So if you're questioning whether you can ride it or not, I would definitely try out the test seat. But going back to the entrance, there's only one technical entrance. Now this entrance actually splits in two quite early on, where you can choose which side you like to go to, at least on the emptier days. But you will find that the left side queue, or technically the purple side queue is what I'm going to call it, because it does house the purple half of the train, is a lot longer, or at least it seems that way. And there's nothing too fancy with this queue. It is mainly just wood fencing as well as bar fencing, which is just like a metal bar. But you do get some nice views of Tidal Twister behind, of course, a fence, because we don't need you going into that area and something bad happening. But you can get very, very close to the ride itself from the queue, especially on that purple side, because you are just lined up against that fence the entire way until you take a stairway up, and then you're pretty much at the station. But now talking about the blue side queue, you do keep going, and it almost looks like you're going into a backstage area. But then you hook a left, and then there's a TV overhead, and then you hook another left, kind of in a weird switchback, until you do another right, and then you're upstairs there until you reach that loading platform. Now, something I do want to mention, if you cannot take stairs, there is a ramp in one of the exits, and that exit is on the purple side, which is actually the side closest to the main midway. So if you do need to take a ramp up to the ride, there is an access ramp on the side of the midway at the exit of the ride. And it's pretty easy to see from almost all points, except for when you're waiting on the other side of the ride in the queue. Now, I know you're probably really eager to find out what the ride experience is like, but I do want to talk about some ride requirements really quick. And to start them off, just you cannot be pregnant, no heart conditions, all the basic regular stuff that you find on most rides. But the height requirement is 48 inches. So you don't have to be the tallest rider in order to experience this attraction. And I think it is more suited for that family thrill audience. Even though I would say it's one of the more thrilling rides in the park. It's definitely more thrilling than Manta, but not as thrilling as Electric Eel. Well, maybe I shouldn't say thrilling, but more extreme in a way. But just to let you know, 48 inches is the height requirement. And I don't know if there's actually a height limit, because we actually did see some 6'5" people riding, shout out to James, by the way, and they didn't seem to have a problem with that. And 6'5" is usually the cutoff for a lot of rides like Hang Time, but that's something you might just have to go and ask the ride operators when you get to SeaWorld San Diego. Alright, here we go, on to the ride experience itself. Now, regardless of which loading platform you are on, you will go through the loading platform, and usually they will make you walk all the way to the opposite end where the exit is and load farthest car away to the closest. So it does load a little more like a flat ride. There is no specific gates per row or anything like that. And they seemed pretty lenient when there wasn't enough people on the train to let us choose what row we were in. But of course, this was on the first day of any public operation, so it might have changed by now. But of course, once you find your seat, you'll realize that either you will have no one in front of you and a great view of either the dummy chassis in between the two sides of the train, or you will have just the track in front of you when you're on the end of the train itself. But if you're sitting in any other row, you will be facing another person, potentially from your own party. But if there's only two of you, potentially not. So if you're worried about looking at someone you don't know, I would definitely recommend having the second person from your party riding directly in front of you. If you can, of course. They might not allow that. I really don't know. I don't see why they wouldn't, though. But there's a lot of things to notice when you first sit down. The first thing is the grip tape on the bottom of the floor. And I think this is just to prevent, legs flying up and hitting other people, because it is in quite close quarters. If you've been on a Larson Superloop, you kind of know that feeling of that interlocked legs or just like scrunched legs feeling that you get on those rides. But I don't think it's too cramped, and there's definitely enough room to just keep your legs to yourself. So I'm not too worried about that. But one thing you will realize is there's not a lot of padding on the back of the headrest. So it's definitely not a ride that I would say is the most comfortable for the back of your head, especially if you're a taller rider. I am about 6 foot, so I was on that threshold of where the actual padding stopped. So I was against pretty much straight up fiberglass. But then again, I am a bit taller than the average person, so that might have been why it was affecting me. But that's one thing I would change a little bit. It's just a little more padding on the back side of your head. Now, the seats themselves are actually not bad at all in comfortability. I didn't really mind them, and I thought they were actually more comfortable than some other rides that I've been on, like the seats on Zamperla Giant Discoveries. I definitely like a little less than the seats on Tidal Twister, and I think they fit quite nicely to the human body. But here's the next thing you'll notice, of course, is when you pull them down, the restraints. These are over-the-shoulder restraints. They do call them a lap bar, but I can see why they call them a lap bar. It is only technically touching your lap. It really does not touch your shoulders whatsoever, even for the taller riders, and they are padded quite heavily, which I am a big fan of. I think it will need the pads eventually, but we'll get onto that a little later on. But just to let you know, you will not have the restraints actually touching your shoulders whatsoever. And I found them quite snug, in all honesty. You don't have to pull them down all the way. It's actually quite hard to pull them down all the way until you're stapled completely. But they are definitely a little harder to pull down and push up than a lot of restraints, I would say. But a nice little feature on these restraints are tiny little handlebars on the sides that you can grab onto if you're really feeling like it. And I actually found myself grabbing onto those at some points during the ride experience, because I actually found it a little more comfortable than just letting my hands go freely. But of course, once you have the restraint down, you do have to buckle on, and that is the same type of buckle that is on electric eels. So if you know what the buckle is for electric eels comfort collars, it's that same type of buckle that connects to a seatbelt that comes out from between your legs. Now, of course, once we're seated, it's time to finally get this train moving. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that when you sit down, the train is actually at a 0-degree angle in comparison to the ground. So it's just flat. You can just walk on it normally. It's not slanted or anything. So it's quite easy to get in and out of course, disregarding the other riders in your car. But once everyone's restraint is locked and you are good to go, your seats will tilt 45 degrees to the side. And the mechanism that does this is quite impressive, I would say. It actually starts out from the ends and then goes into the middle to make sure every car is moving along. But I do see this as a potential problem in the future because it is one of the most advanced systems on a ride like this. I could see it having potential problems in the future. And this was the result of about 2 or 3 breakdowns that we witnessed during the day. And that was just one of the cars didn't lock properly and didn't go down with the rest of the cars. So they had to reset the system, lock it from the top, and then go back down. But it's very cool to witness it, and it's actually even cooler to be on ride with it because it's not something that you experience a lot, just going from straight up to kind of a dangling 45-degree angle. You do get kind of pushed to the side a little bit just because gravity is pulling you that way. But it's kind of a cool experience, and it's not something you get to experience on a lot of rides. But now it's time to start moving along, and you're gonna get pushed back and forth by drive tires on the side of that lowering and raising mechanism. And this attaches to fins that are on the side of every chassis of every car, and they will slowly push you back and forth over the airtime hill and also into the 0G roll multiple times until, of course, the ride cycle is over. But just so you know, it will not start off as the quickest ride in the world. It does take a little bit of time to get into that speed, so don't be surprised if you go up and down the airtime hill or into the inversion twice before you actually make it through a full circuit around the entire track. And during this portion of the ride, it's just kind of waiting in anticipation to see how it will all be. And actually, you can feel the drive tires more during this point of the ride than any other point of the ride. From viewing the ride from the queue as well as near the exit, you can definitely see that the drive tires as well as the train fins don't exactly hit the same spot every time. And of course, that is just because rubber is very elastic and it bounces back and forth. And there's a lot of physics to do with that. But of course, also with the changing speeds, it will be hitting different spots in the tire when it's going at a slower pace than the tire itself. So this is probably one of the rougher parts of the ride, I would say. Or maybe not rougher, but more bumpy, because you definitely do feel kind of a bump as you go through the drive tire section. But once you've gained enough speed, you will either go through the 0G roll if you're on the blue side, or you will go over the airtime hill if you're on the purple side. And of course, the first time through over the airtime hill, you really won't get any airtime. It's just kind of a nice look at the side of the Bayside Amphitheater, as well as kind of the backstage area. But if you're going through the 0G roll first, holy cow, it is some of the best hang time I have ever experienced. We're talking V2 on the 45-degree spike. We're talking full throttle's first loop. We're talking a Larson loop where they just hold you up top for 10 seconds. It is legitimately some of the best hang time I've ever experienced, and I'm not kidding about that. I'm not exaggerating. The hang time was powerful enough and plentiful enough that riders across from me ended up having their heads turn from red to purple at some points because of the amount of hang time we were experiencing. Now, of course, this won't happen every single time because every ride cycle seems to be a little different. But our second ride, which was actually the official POV ride, we were on inside portion of the purple side of the train, meaning we were facing the dummy chassis, and we got suspended upside down for a good 10 to 12 seconds, which was amazing as an enthusiast to experience. But going back to the speed of the ride, once you get through that element, you will start picking up the pace gradually until you hit a nice 30 miles an hour or 60 miles an hour combined. But while you're going through each element, in between each of those elements, there is the station platforms that are a 45-degree turn. Now, going into these turns, you will of course encounter the drive tires again. It does get smoother throughout the ride, I will say that now, but you still get a little bit of bumpiness, just a tiny bit, not bad enough to warrant headbanging or anything like that. I actually only got headbanging on one of my rides out of the 7 that I had in the entire day, and that was when I was facing backwards at the inside of the train near the dummy chassis. I would definitely say towards the center of the main train itself, next to the dummy chassis, is definitely going to be a little more bumpy than the ends of the train. And of course, if you're going backwards, you won't be able to anticipate every little twist and turn, so that might cause a little more bumpiness. But really, the ride itself is quite smooth. There is a couple patches where you do get an excessive bump or so, and that is especially noticeable out of the 0G roll into the purple side station. There is one bump there that's a little excessive, but besides that, the ride itself is actually very, very smooth. It looks really bumpy in the reverse POVs, but you don't really notice it to be that bumpy on ride. But once you've picked up the pace of the top speed, 30 miles an hour, you do go through this layout quite quickly. The airtime hill actually gives some decent floater at some points, and the 0G roll, of course, gives some immaculate hang time. And those two elements actually are incredibly smooth. It's just going into the station and fighting off the drive tires, as well as that one little part going into the purple side station that might cause you some bumpiness. But overall, the ride is actually pretty smooth in comparison to what I've heard Harley Quinn Crazy Coaster is like. And I know that's going to be the main issue that a lot of riders will probably come up with about Tidal Twister. And I think that's a fair statement. Out of all the coasters I've been on at SeaWorld, it is probably the roughest. But I mean, out of the 3 that I've been on, Tidal Twister being the roughest is not a bad thing at all. Because if that's your roughest ride, I don't think you have anything to worry about rough-wise. Now, you will go through the layout about 5, maybe 6 times potentially, and the ride cycle is about 1 minute and 10 seconds long, but I think it's a great cycle. You get to do everything enough times. I don't think it should be more or less than what it is. But once you start slowing down, you might get a little more of that bumpiness from just the different speed of the drive tires and yourself, but then you will soon find yourself coming to a halt, and you might get some of that excellent hang time again, or just be on top of the airtime hill. And it will take a good 15-20 seconds to finally line up with the station properly. And then of course, the mechanism will lock into place and you'll be lifted back up to be straight up. And then of course, you will be let off the ride. Now, my favorite element is definitely the 0G roll. I think it makes the ride, in all honesty. I had some rides where I didn't really enjoy anything else besides the 0G roll. But I had some rides where I actually really enjoyed the airtime hill. It was a nice bit of floater. And I really think the ride design is actually quite great. It's just that the execution is not 100% yet, but I would say it's very close to it. And you also have to remember, this is their second ride of this type of style in a park, and it's technically the first of its model ever created. So it is kind of a first of its kind. But I will say, out of my 7 rides, I thoroughly enjoyed Tidal Twister. I enjoyed it a heck of a lot more than I was expecting. I was not expecting to really have too much fun on the ride. Besides, of course, in the 0G roll, I always could tell that was going to be the star of the attraction. But I ended up thoroughly surprised by the airtime hill, as well as even the turns in the station can become quite thrilling once you hit that top speed. And one thing I forgot to mention is the color scheme. I actually think it looks quite nice. The entire area is kind of a purple, blue, pink, yellow. It's just kind of a lot of funky colors that actually end up looking quite nice together. But anyways, I really must say I enjoyed the ride overall. And I was fighting myself about what to rate it in multiple different categories because I was very confused. Judging by each ride that I got, it changed quite a lot. The ride cycles were never exactly the same, and some gave a heck of a lot more hang time, but also some gave a lot more bumpiness, some gave more air time. It also really depends where you sit, but even within the same seat, it might be a different ride experience. So it's very hard to be able to tell what type of ride you're going to have on it. So I would actually recommend riding it 2 or 3 times if you don't like it the first time, just to see if it's really bad in your own eyes. I would definitely ride it multiple times to get a good feel for the ride itself. And I mean, I rode it 7 times and I still feel like I don't have a solidified opinion, at least completely solidified, because every ride I had was different. I had some rides where I would rate it an 8.5 out of 10. Like it was that good on the hang time and it was very smooth and I got some good floater air time. But there were some rides where I didn't really have any of that, and I got some of the bumpiness, which I would have rated closer to maybe a 5.5, maybe a 5. So it's definitely a hit or miss. I know some people I talked to were rating it, like a 3 out of 10. I know one person said a 5 out of 10, and I had one person say a 10 out of 10. So it's really across the board with how people feel about this. But I definitely think it's the best fit for the area that they were given. I would prefer it over a Larson Superloop any day. And I really think it fits in that space quite nicely. The only problem I really have with that space, if you're coming right out of the exits, you can get some loudness from the ride itself. So it is quite loud over there near the touch pools and in that area. But once you pass by on the midway, you can barely hear it whatsoever. It's very quiet from the midway. I'm wondering if they put in soundproofing within the station itself, but it's very, very quiet from the midway itself. And it's quiet enough because you can hear the piano from Shipwreck Rapids over Tidal Twister most of the time. But it's that time, I gotta get into my ratings for the ride. And if you did not know, I have a new rating system from our Manta review a couple months back. I changed up my entire rating system. So we technically give 4 different ratings. One for just fun, one for intensity, one that's like a ski resort rating, and then one that is just an overall score. Now for intensity, I gotta say, out of 5 stars, I would say it's 3.5 stars for intense. It's not the most intense thing in the world, but it's definitely a lot more intense than you might expect, especially with the 0G roll if you have it in the beginning of the ride cycle. It can definitely pack a punch with the hang time, enough so that my temples ended up hurting after a good 4 or 5 rides because the hang time was so intense. But besides that, the ride itself is not very intense at all. But I think this would be a great ride to be your first looping ride for sure. It's very low to the ground, so you don't have that height factor that might scare some people off. And it's not intense enough where that might scare you as well. Now for the fun rating, I'm actually going to give it a 3 out of 5 stars, just because I would say this is more of an intense ride than fun. But that's not a knock towards the ride at all. I still think it's quite fun. It's just not all focused about fun. It's more of almost a perfect introduction to going upside down on a ride. And I would definitely say this is in the intermediate category, at least in my mind. So it would be a blue square if it was at a ski resort. It's definitely more intense than Manta, for sure. It's also a little more extreme than Manta, but that's just because of the roll. But the entire ride experience itself is about on par with Manta in terms of you being just an intermediate rider before getting on. I would definitely say this shouldn't be your first coaster or anything like that, but I would definitely say after riding a couple coasters or a couple of smaller rides, you would definitely be okay with riding this. But just make sure you can handle some of the other rides in the park before you get on Tidal Twister. I would even say go on Manta before Tidal Twister, but Tidal Twister is definitely not the most insane thing in the park. I would say Electric Eel still takes that as first place just because of how tall it is, how fast it is, and the non-inverting loop as well. But now it's time for my overall rating, and this is going to be out of 10. And I would have to say, I know this might be a little controversial, but I'm gonna go in between a 6.5 and a 7. It really surprised me in a lot more ways than I was expecting, and ended up being quite good in my eyes and a perfect fit for SeaWorld San Diego. I would still put it under Electric Eel and Manta, but that's not a knock at all. Electric Eel is a very, very solid ride, and Manta is just ridiculously good for being a family coaster. But a 7 out of 10 is honestly really good in my eyes for a prototype attraction like it is. Now, I know a lot of people are probably going to ask me, do I think it's a coaster or a flat ride? I'm actually, after riding it, leaning towards more of the flat ride argument, believe it or not. I would just say straight up powered coaster before riding, but after riding, it definitely feels more like a flat ride than a coaster itself. But again, that's not a knock towards the ride or anything. That's just something to keep in mind if you want to put it on your coaster count or not. But I personally have started leaning away from the roller coaster argument, because it's definitely either a powered coaster in my mind or potentially a flat ride. It definitely has the feel of a flat ride, at least, even though it technically might just be a powered coaster. And before you start saying, oh, it's powered by gravity the entire time, well, technically it's always in contact with drive tires regardless, and that would make it fit the bill of powered coaster. One thing I want to mention is the fact that the dueling is not really adding to the ride at all. You really don't get that sense that you're dueling someone, because it's kind of hard to see any other side of the train except for when you're in the station and you kind of poke your head out and around. So the dueling aspect isn't really there, at least in my eyes. And I could see dueling be a better fit for something like Harley Quinn, of course, which I would think has a better opportunity of actually seeing your dueling trains. But there you have it. Have you ridden Tidal Twister? Let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. Thank you for staying tuned for this entire lengthy review. My actual recording is over an hour before I edit it, so it's been quite crazy trying to talk about this ride for that long and going through every little detail that I could think of. But I overall really enjoyed the ride. A lot more than I was expecting. But please let me know what your thoughts are, because I know it's going to be kind of all over the place, especially for those riders that have only ridden it once. But thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you have not. We're going to have more reviews in the future, including one for Calico River Rapids, hopefully very soon. But of course, as always, we'll see you on the next ride.